Hey Nelson,
Yes, yes, Allison.
can you turn off your camera and are you still sharing your screen?
Uh yeah, you know what? Something popped up now.
Mhm,
The I am proud to be carbon neutral one.
mhm,
So maybe I
mhm,
have to
mhm.
share again.
Nope, nope, you're good to go. If you just want to turn off your camera,
Oh, turn
you
it
can go
off my
ahead.
camera.
Yeah, yes.
And stop sharing.
Yeah, perfect.
So I do
Yeah.
that like okay, turn like that.
Y-
How's that now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes. There's still people getting on. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Carbon Neutral Footprint Verification webinar. My name is Allison Carlson, and I will be your moderator today. We will be discussing carbon emissions, benefits of the GHG emissions, carbon footprint, the carbon verification process, and much, much more. Before I introduce you to our speakers, I would like to tell you a little bit more about Bureau Veritas. So here at Bureau Veritas, we were established in 1828, and we are almost 200 years old. We will be 200-year old in 2028. So I definitely think that earns some bragging rights. We service over 400,000 customers worldwide, have offices in 140 different countries, and over 80,000 employees. Our vision at Bureau Veritas is to become the leader in our industry and a major player in each of our market segments and key geographical markets. And our mission is to deliver economic value to customers through the QHSESA management of their assets, projects, products, and systems, resulting in license to operate, risk reduction, and performance improvement. I do want to go over a few housekeeping things here for the webinar. I will be keeping everybody's microphone off and also keeping cameras off. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to use our Q&A portion. We have a lot of new people that are on in the industry and a lot of old people are been around for many, many years. And I'm sure people may have the same questions that you do. So please, please definitely ask questions if you want. In case if you don't get any of your questions answered, we will definitely be having our speakers reach back out to you to get those questions answered. Also, the webinar will be recorded today, and the recording and slides will be shared with the participants after via email. Also, a follow-up to this webinar, we will be offering a course December 5th. It's a virtual one-day course on carbon sustainability, and you will receive a certification for that. And it's also taught by our speaker today, Nelson Lee. I will put that link in our Q&A section, so if you want to look further into that, you have that choice there. And real quick here, before I get into introducing Nelson Lee, we did have John Stenglin, who is BV's Sustainability Business Unit Manager. He was going to be on our webinar today, but unfortunately he has fallen ill and he won't be participating. So without any further ado, I'm going to give you some information on our speaker today. We have Nelson Lee here with us. He is BV Sustainability Instructor. He is the founder of Green Sky Sustainability Incorporated. He has been in the industry over 40 years. He has completed over 500 GHG verifications, and he's also a professional engineer. He's passionate about our individual responsibility as stewards of the ecosystem. And Nelson is a channel to enable organizations to understand their role in climate change, how climate change will affect them, and what they can do to be more resilient and even benefit from the opportunities. So without any further ado, please, Nelson, go ahead and take it over and let's learn everything we can about our carbon footprint.
Thank you very much, Allison, and hi to everyone. I'm coming to you from Vancouver, Canada, which we say is the territory, the ancestral territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And we're privileged to be here on these lands. And so let me just share the screen. So here's my screen, a number of slides over the next half hour or so. And try to, assuming everybody's coming with a clean slate, blank slate, I'm trying to tell you about all the reasons that greenhouse gas inventory should be prepared and be carbon neutral and even go for verification, third-party verification. So to begin with, just at the beginning, from an accounting perspective, what are carbon emissions? Sometimes that's a bit of a jargon. It's actually greenhouse gases, GHGs. And so CO2 being one of the major ones that we sometimes call them carbon emissions or CO2, but there's a whole family, and we'll talk about more of that later. What happens is these greenhouse gas emissions are released into the air, the atmosphere, and where they trap heat. And we're experiencing that heat, whether in the form of more aggressive, if you might call them, extreme events, weather getting worse and getting hotter, and all kinds of impacts from that. Again, we'll talk a little bit more of that later. But it's a steady trend for the last 150, 200 years, but particularly in our generation, right? The last 30 or 40 years, half the emissions have gone into the atmosphere. So just in my career alone. And then carbon emissions result, there are natural causes for sure. And as a matter of fact, water vapor is one of the biggest, not drivers, but biggest effects. There's greenhouse gas effects, but water vapor is not a driver. So the drivers are these carbon emissions, which primarily are combustion of fossil fuels, about 70% from that. Other things, fires, of course, are going to put emissions up there. And what we do when we destroy wetlands and other activities like that, well, there's more greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the planet's ecosystem is in a kind of a balance. And so we as humans contribute to emissions going to the atmosphere, but there's also emissions coming out into our oceans, into our soils, into plants and things like that. So there's a kind of a balance, although that balance is tending to shift, and we're overwhelming that for sure. Whoops. And here. So which are the greenhouse gas emissions? Carbon, as you will, maybe carbon dioxide being the primary one, about 70% or so being from carbon dioxide. When we combust fossil fuels, we also emit methane and nitrous oxide, the first two. And those three together probably contribute to most 95% of the greenhouse gas emissions. There are some more specialty, you might call them specialty greenhouse gas emissions, like the hydrofluorocarbons. Those would be in all kinds of air conditioning and chillers and coolers, which is a big part of our businesses, right? We need that, and even our homes for our air conditioning. Some of the other ones are a little bit more specific. For example, perfluorocarbons, often associated with aluminum industry, maybe a few other sectors. Sulfur hexafluoride. This is a very inert, very stable gas that's often used in transformers for switch gears to prevent a static charge when these have huge electrical potentials when they're switching the gear, because it's a very inert gas for safety purposes. And then nitrogen trifluoride, NF3, often in our flat panels. So you may be watching this presentation on a computer or something with a flat panel. Probably NF3 was emitted in that process. So those are the several major. There are other ones like carbon black and a few others. So, but anyways, why should we care is maybe the big question, because we're we're experiencing the results of enhanced greenhouse gases. So we're seeing ice melting, certainly at both poles, and in particular, say maybe the Arctic, but glaciers. If you live anywhere near any of the glaciers, I'm close to some glaciers in BC. They're melting, and yeah, we're having changing weather pattern in a warming world, right? And of course, that's contributing to rising sea level, both from more ice and water, white ice turning to water going into the oceans, but also from the warming of the water itself, because something like 93% of all the heat goes into our oceans. So that water expands when it's heated, of course. I mentioned the extreme weather. We had two almost back-to-back, what is it, Beryl and Helena hurricanes that may have been enhanced or become worse or had some other unique characteristics as a result of climate change. And those are some of the worst ones. If you're anywhere near food growing, that has probably you experience some impacts from climate change in agriculture. It could be either drought on the one hand, or higher temperatures, crops don't grow as well, or flooding. And then air quality, particularly from forest fires. We've been pretty fortunate the last year. It wasn't as bad in North America anyways, but certainly California and other parts, my area, British Columbia, experienced some really terrible ones, and across Canada, catastrophic in 2022. And it's not just people who suffer, it's our species. We are in the sixth great mass extinction, and climate change is possibly driving some of that or making it a little bit worse, particularly in the oceans. The corals are suffering really bad. On the right hand, you see some of the scenarios. We're fortunately, people have mastered, we're not on this red line, the high worst case scenario, but we're probably still closer to this kind of orange line, the next best case, kind of a mid-level. It would be ideal to be on the blue line, trying to hold our temperature to 1.5, but we're pretty close to that limit now, which really is a limit. There's some real harm that we may experience going above that. So the sooner we can bend these curves down to that blue or even lower, the better. So it affects all of us. We should all care. Now the benefits, it's not just, if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not just reducing those impacts, but associated with that is there's air pollution associated with a lot of those burning the fossil fuels. There's air emissions, and 7 million people die a year prematurely from that. So human health could be expected to improve, biodiversity would improve, and the whole ecosystem in effect. And companies, your organizations, when you contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you stand to benefit from reputational enhancement. People, hey, there's a company that's doing something, right? And that could be maybe just enough difference to get those contracts ahead of a competitor, right? Or even more, propelling yourself into the fast lane, being, a popular brand, a more popular brand. Preparing for the future today, we're going to mention carbon neutrality. I have a few slides on that and what that is related to net zero and how that can benefit. I have some customers who are actually asked by their banks after receiving financing that you must report your greenhouse gas emissions every year, and we want to see some kind of improvement, right? A metric. So we're doing that verification. So in order to attract that investment, attract the capital, whether from banks or stock purchases, that can be helpful. And of course, one of the beauties about it right now, when we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're often fuel switching. We're switching to an energy source that's less expensive, basically. Solar, wind, whatnot, batteries can be less expensive, EVs for that matter. So it's kind of a win-win-win type of situation. You probably recognize some of these names, different sectors. The key thing is I could have maybe brought more sectors and more brands up here, but it's everywhere, right? Many more. All these organizations have made a commitment to reduce their carbon footprint, across even their supply chain. And maybe your name's already on there. Maybe you will be adding your name, your brand to this list. It's just a partial list. Hard to keep up with it all. What are the sources? Where do they rise? And one of the I guess the challenges of greenhouse gas management is that they arrive from just about everything we do. Everything we do just to exist and live. In our buildings and facilities, you all have those. You probably have transportation for either your staff or your products. As you produce them, you're using energy. Often that's emitting greenhouse gases, maybe directly through combustion or indirectly through use of electricity that's also using fossil fuels to generate that electricity. Distributing your products, sales, and then ultimately in the waste end, particularly they say food products that get wasted. There's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions there, and there's a few others too. So when it comes to sources, as I mentioned, it's mainly the fuel. So 70 or 80% the combustion of any kind of fuel. You think about natural gas, diesel, gasoline, propane, kerosene, aviation fuels, bunker fuels, you name it. So anytime we use any kind of fuels, we're converting a hydrocarbon into CO2, CH4, and some N2O. Agriculture is certainly cattle raising is one of the biggest sources, but also landfills and that kind of thing. We have a waste category on the end. Most of our chemical production, not most, I should say, some of our chemical production, things like adipic acid or making, lime, quick lime or things like that, will emit greenhouse gases just as a matter, like a unit of product gives you a unit of greenhouse gases. And then some gases are just emitted directly, like say the HFC, for example. And when I mention waste, in particular, the organics going into landfills, they decompose going into CH4 methane, potent greenhouse gas. You may have seen this before and heard, scope 1, 2, and 3. I like the ISO definition of direct and indirect, but however you work it, direct emissions are the ones that the emissions happen on your site. You have control over them. You buy the fuel, you choose the fuel, you choose the equipment, and those emissions happen on your site. Now, scope 2 emissions, this also is an indirect one because the emissions actually happen somewhere else, not on your site. They happen at the power plant or somewhere along there. But you buy the electricity. And again, you really have control over that. How much you use, the energy efficiency of the equipment you choose, all that. So it is kind of a special category, like scope 1. So often companies will report scope 1, the direct emissions for sure. Sometimes the scope 2 are those indirect energy emissions. And it could be more than electricity, it could be steam, other things like that. The scope 3, these other ones, and the way this one, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol presents it is like there's upstream activities and there's downstream activities related to your operations. And any of the emissions upstream or downstream, those in your supply chain, which you may not have control, but you have influence for sure. You can choose vendors, you can choose the location, the source. You can make a big difference. How much to spend, when to spend, which products to buy, and what services to engage. Right. So you have some control, some influence at least. Right. So that's why the idea of including them in your greenhouse gas inventory it came about. Right. Yeah. So you could do the inventory, you have your inventory, you may manage it, but should you report it and why you have to report it? Well, in the United States, you have to report if you're emitting over 25,000 tons. US EPA collects that data. Part of the 40 CFR Part 98, you have to report. So those, and there's other ones. California has their program, their CARB program, AB 32. You have to report under certain conditions. But there's a lot of voluntary ones. And as I mentioned, the one client I had, the bank made them report. Investors, in particular, are often asking, we want to see what your greenhouse gas emissions are. Report that. I was teaching a course to some students. I said, find me the companies that have a sustainability report. It was very easy for them to do this, right? 15 students came up with maybe 100 different companies. They all have sustainability reports. They all are reporting, or most of those were reporting greenhouse gas emissions. So those are the reasons. Voluntary, mandatory is coming, and it's just growing and growing. The Securities Exchange Commission, had a rule. I'm not fully up to date on where they are, but they're looking for that kind of disclosure too, maybe by the turn of the decade, right, 2030 range. And it's just coming more and more. It's international too, so it's not just US and Canada, North America, it's everywhere. Now, I mentioned that there could be voluntary reasons and mandatory reasons, but apart from the mandatory, why voluntarily report? And well, customers sometimes are looking for that. Right? Some customers are looking to create their carbon input footprint, and they need you as a supplier, they need your information to do that. Employees, more and more, especially the younger generations, are really tuned into this, and they want to know. They want you to report. The shareholders, I mentioned, and just the license, social license to operate. Those are other reasons. Now, the road to reporting, it's usually starts at the top. Larger organizations, and they may be in the process of improving and expanding their reporting. Others are just starting, and as you get into the procurement process, many, you could just imagine, there's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, all the suppliers. There's many companies that may be getting into this. And on the right hand, you see that wheel of the carbon accounting, and every aspect of this matters. Top management, leadership for sure, investors driving them, putting pressure on them, and consumers, all the society demands, right? All pushing on leadership, say, hey, we want to know, you got to report, you got to be transparent, what's going on, just even finding out. And one of the biggest drivers on this wheel is right down the bottom, opposite the leadership, competitors. Competitor starts doing something and you're not doing that, well, it kind of makes a differentiation, right? And so that another big driver. And I can't emphasize the importance of, like, say, employee satisfaction. I was preparing one course and I said, it goes something like, good employees are essential. Committed employees are transformational. When you're committed to this carbon management, they'll get on board. That's powerful. There's various standards. The two main standards for quantifying the greenhouse gas protocol and the ISO standards. So ISO is ISO 14064 Part 1. They're really essentially the same when it comes down to what the inventory looks like at the end. They kind of have different information, maybe different categorization in some ways, but people have compared the two approaches. There's really not that much difference. One of the things is the ISO protocol calls direct and indirect greenhouse gas protocol refers to scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, right? And there is something called validation. It's kind of a forward-looking, but all the verification is backward-looking, right, or historical. Other methods, DEFRA is from the UK. It's like kind of their EPA of the UK, and of course our EPA and other groups, right? There's other standards. The two above are the main ones. So the process, how to create an inventory, how to manage the inventory. Well, first of all, maybe, just think about it. What is your organization? Maybe have some kind of design and think of the software and whatnot. The key thing is establishing the boundaries, right? So pick a standard, establish the boundaries, go to prepare your account. Identifying the emission sources. How are you going to go about collecting that activity? Is it centralized or decentralized method? What kind of emission factors are used? How to calculate what are the methodologies used and things like that. And how are you going to roll it up, particularly in a corporate thing? How to roll up from all the local manufacturing, for example, or distribution, how to roll that up into corporate. That can be a bit of a challenge too. Are you using software like Excel, or are you using databases? When you document it, obviously having a report is everything's gathered in something like a report, and people are more and more looking to get those verified. Anybody can prepare a report. What does it matter? Can I trust it? Is it reliable? That's where the verifying comes in. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then develop the inventory and that process. And then the final step is maybe, can you reduce? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then how you're going to track those emissions. So start with the inventory. Again, get those boundaries. What are the sources? When you reduce the emissions, you can think about, well, where is maybe the low-hanging fruit? It may come from your stationary and mobile emissions in particular, because that's the biggest source. And I would say recommend reduce where it makes sense to reduce, right? Like if you just bought something brand new, like a brand new truck, you're probably not going to replace it with an EV right away. Wait till it's, getting into its life, that kind of thing. There is the opportunity to remove emissions like forest, planting trees, or improving wetlands, that kind of thing. More and more talk about carbon capture and sequestration or direct air capture. Those kind of things, a little expensive, but maybe considered. One thing you can consider is offsetting emissions. So think of some good sources, the reasonable price for you, and then the ones that align with your values. Energy efficiency is always the best, because the energy you don't use is that's the best saving. You save money there. So try to work with energy efficiency, insulation in buildings, preventing leaks in those buildings. And there are a lot of incentives, government incentives for that. Heat pumps deliver 300 to 500% efficiency, because they're actually not generating energy. They're transferring it. They're bringing it in from outside, or air or water. And they can be for space heating or water heating. And again, there's incentives. Electric vehicles have the lowest cost of ownership already. Sometimes they're the cheaper vehicle in their category. It depends on brand, of course, and you can get some very expensive EVs. I was looking around the other day, and wow, pretty pricey. But you can shop and get cheaper ones, and there are more and more models that would be available. And certainly in typical ownership, less than 10 years, you're going to pay for this, sometimes in just a few months, sometimes in a few years, because it's cheaper to run an EV and lower emissions. And often they're government incentives. Final one, if you can, generate your own energy, probably mostly solar and batteries, is the cheapest source of electricity that you will have at your home for most people. Maybe the odd jurisdiction is different, but it'll also provide enhanced resilience, because no grid is 100% reliable. So having your own generation ability and batteries to store when you can't generate that electricity, that's the best. And there are incentives for those too. I mentioned, if you're looking for emission factors, this is the way most emissions are calculated. So activity data times the emission factor times the global warming potential is how most emissions are calculated. And these are some sources. There are very many, but certainly the US EPA has some that you can use. The management process, certainly what we like to have is that any inventory has its own quality management process. So the right data was used to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions and whatnot. That means you probably have some kind of team, at least one champion to guide the process. But in any organization of size, you're going to have a team, many people involved, and you need to have a kind of a plan. Everybody following the same plan, doing the same thing. And some general QA, QC, whether it's ISO 9001 or any, it could be ISO 14001 too. Any of these kind of management system approaches are good. And then you come up with the final inventory. Maybe you decide you want to reduce emissions, go through that process year after year after year. So the feedback loop, again, it's a plan, do, check, act. This is a typical management process, and with leadership in the middle driving it. But anything goes better when you have a good plan to start. You implement that, and as you implement that, you observe and you find out that maybe there's opportunity for improvement. You can make those improvements, create a better plan, better inventory, and on and on. So documentation is important, and because of course that's one of the things that a third-party verifier is going to be looking at. They're looking at the documentation. And of course the equipment, other things in there, but the document to prove it. And it could be third-party documentation like reports, lab tests, that kind of thing, or the reports from your organization and information like version control and access to the data, and make sure that no one can tamper with it. All those kind of things are very important. Most greenhouse gas programs ask you to keep your information for at least 7 years. Some I've heard even 10. So that documentation is a big part of it. Like, think of taxes, right? Like the same kind of thing. You need it. Now, what is a third-party verification? Well, it's an independent review, another party providing some kind of assurance. The main standard for greenhouse gas verification is ISO 14064 Part 3. This is the one, this standard has been used since about 2006. That's when I kind of got involved with this kind of work as a verifier. And it provides guidance for the verifiers to verify a greenhouse gas statement from reporters, like say yourselves. Now, the benefit to you about using a verifier is that you get assurance, right? You know that your statement is correct, is fit for purpose, like maybe reporting to the government or for shareholders or financiers, that kind of thing. So it meets all the VER requirements, satisfies all the needs, and helps with both internal and external stakeholders. Right? Any independent review, they bring a fresh pair of eyes, and not just any fresh pair of eyes. Most verifiers are going to be pretty familiar with carbon accounting methodology. They probably know your sector. Any good one would know your sector quite well, and the regulatory requirements. So that can help. They pick out opportunity for improvement or even some mistakes. Help certainly if you have regulatory requirements, the verifier is sometimes actually you have to, right? There's a mandate, like California, for example. Through my country, just about every province has their own requirement, mandatory to have a third-party verification of a greenhouse gas report. We'll identify errors, and that'll give you opportunity to improve, and then you get a verification statement from the verifier, and you can show that around. That's your evidence, like a report card or even a certificate or a diploma you get from the university, right? That kind of thing. How about that? Wasn't shared. So the process, how do you get engaged? Well, there's usually we call it pre-engagement. This is going by ISO 14064 Part 3, where the pre-engagement will be, you might call it the RFP process. So you get to find, who is a good greenhouse gas verifier, and the verifier will want to know all about your scope and your objectives and that kind of thing. And then ultimately, maybe contract that one. Then the verifier will select a team. You can communicate the process, give you a plan. Here's a plan we're going to follow. They conduct the verification. There'll be some maybe giving back information sharing questions. You may be asked to revise some information or correct something, provide evidence. Quite often that's a case. Ultimately, you end up at the far end of the right-hand side, a verification statement, something that the verifier provides. And yeah, this is something you could say, we've got it. People post it on their website or share it around to their customers, their clients, and that kind of thing. Now, how do you prepare for verification? Well, some of the things, just understand your operations, inventory, how are you going to develop your greenhouse gas inventory, that kind of thing. And find a verifier that that maybe aligns with your needs. So you can ask the verifier questions about them, that kind of thing. So you will be asked for written processes of how data is managed, maybe some flow charts so we can see all the different sources, maybe equipment specifications, gas analyses, that kind of thing. And the verifier will arrange access to your system, so they can see where all the information is housed, how to get it. It could be electronic documents, it could be something you visit, that kind of thing. They block off a time in the calendar. When it's mandatory, it's often the same time of the year, right? That's when the verification season is, if you will. When it's voluntary, that's what I like, because then it could be any time of the year, right? Just whenever you're ready, or when you have want to release your sustainability report. What to expect? Well, you're going to be interviewed for sure. There's going to be some communication. So usually a point person is really good, maybe some key experts in your organization. We definitely look at as the documents I mentioned, anything that can reference a standard, maybe the ISO standards you used, or whatever. Evidence, we're looking for evidence. Show me the evidence. It's not just willy-nilly. We weigh out evidence. And then the calculations, we review things like for accuracy, completeness, consistency, other factors, and making sure you're using the right emission factors, and all the conversions of units. Particularly in the US, you have a lot of conversions, a little bit easier with a metric system. And then there's different communication. So we'll have an opening meeting, there'll be some progress updates, maybe there'll be a question, issues sharing, gaps. Here's your gaps. So we often call it an issues log that we share back and forth, so what the questions are and the issues, and we know what the response is. And then finally, when we're finished a closing meeting, you can share your results. That's kind of the process. It takes about 2 months in typical. Sometimes it could take 3, and I've been working on some that basically take a whole year, and then you're back to starting again for the next year. But yeah, the majority of them, 2 to 3 months is a good time, and as long as everybody's cooperating, right? So we talked a little bit about carbon neutrality, and this is about one of the last few slides. But carbon neutrality is that condition where you have a balance, where your organization is emitting greenhouse gas emissions. You've been able to reduce some of them, but you still have some emissions left over, and then those can be balanced off by, say, maybe getting some offset credits. The verification, there's a standard now, ISO 14068 Part 1, just came out in 2023, called Climate Change Management, the transition to net zero. You may have heard a lot of companies talk about net zero. Well, often net zero is like 2050, but we can be carbon neutral every year, this year, 2024, 25. Through following this standard. And so companies will create that inventory, we will verify them, and you can say, okay, our emissions now are such and such, they came from scope 1, scope 2, what are we reducing, and on from there. When you're balancing them with offsets, one of the things to look at is which offsets, and which to pick, and that kind of thing. And then making claims, the standard talks about what kind of claims, kind of how to word it, right? And what to say to avoid any kind of greenwashing criticism. And then the last slide, just issues and opportunities. Maybe, you may have to correct some the way your data is managed, or the numbers, or the calculations themselves. But you have, in that correction process, you have a way of learning. You learn and you'll get better, and at least you'll know what you're doing right. So there's just anything, even include the documentation procedure, who's a data owner, all this knowledge, building up knowledge in the organization, the capability to produce these inventories. Those are ways you'll improve, and then you'll get better, you get more efficient at it. The first time to create an inventory, it probably takes a bit of an effort, because there's a lot of questions. Am I doing it right? You may be, but you may be not too sure. Once you've gone through the process once, you have a lot more confidence, and you can do it, with less time, cost savings, and work in some emission reductions. And the whole thing is about continual improvement, making that. And then the verifiers, again, those fresh eyes to give you that point of view from the expert. We're not looking for any numbers, high, low, whatever. We're just saying, are those numbers reliable? Is it based on evidence? Is there sufficient and appropriate evidence to support that? Does it meet the requirements of the program if it's a mandatory one, and all that? So I think that's the last slide. I think we can turn it over to you. I'll stop sharing. Allison, back to you. And I think there should be time for some Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Nelson. That was wonderful. So we do have a couple of questions here. Let's see here. The first one is what is the difference between location-based and market-based scope 2 emissions?
Okay, that's something that really is maybe that's a little bit of jargon. What does that mean? So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol likes the idea of a market base. So you may, as an organization, buy electricity. For example, you may also buy some renewable energy certificates to lower the emissions from that, or you may buy from a supplier that says, hey, we have some green, so-called green or cleaner electricity. You can pay a premium for that, and then your emissions from the scope 2 will be less. So that's the kind of thing about a market. The location base is a preference of ISO 14064 Part 1. And the idea is there you get a grid, whatever your grid is, you're plugging in somewhere what the emissions intensity of that grid is. And in the US, you have something called small e, capital letters, grid, GRID in capital, so e-grid. That's a US EPA publication, comes out every year. The value they have is like a year old, of course. So this year you might have a 2023 values. Next year you'll get the 2024 and so on. So it gives you a kind of, for your region, depending on what the grid, how the grid is set up there, you'll get a factor, right? That's how that factor will be used in determining greenhouse gas emission from scope 2, right? That's a location based compared to the market based. You might include RECs, power purchase agreements, other ways of lowering the emission from the scope 2. Hopefully that answers the question. Next one, Allison.
Okay, yeah. So the next one here is who can verify GHG emissions and are they all the same?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in theory, you could say, well, I could hire a first party. I could hire someone. I could just appoint someone in my company, right? They could do that and follow the standard. They might do a good job. The question is, would people consider them independent? So finding an independent one, you could hire a consultant. Again, are they independent? To get real independence, I think the marketplace is going to what they call accredited verification bodies. Now, this is where another body in the US is ANAB, ANSI National Accreditation Body. In Canada, Standards Council of Canada. These are equivalent equivalent parallel organizations. So, and they accredit verification bodies. They kind of give them the authority, just like an accredited lab, for example. They give these verification bodies the authority to do this work. They tell them how, make sure they have processes in place, make sure they have competent people, on and on. So there's it's kind of like a quality function. They accredited, they authorize them, kind of like giving a license to operate. So yeah, third parties are the ones that really do the verification. Now, the second part of that question was, are they all the same? In some respects, they are the same. In other words, if you get an accredited body, they all give you the same stamp of approval, if you will, right? At the end of the day, that's what you want. And they're equivalent in that way, but they're not all the same because you can ask the question, do they understand your sector, right? Are they, how long have they been verifying greenhouse gas emissions? That could be another question. Do they have local representation or are they relatively local, right? So those are kind of things. You may even have language things. If you have international operations, do they have offices there? Can they help you there? So not exactly apples to apples, right?
Mm-hmm. We have one more here, and it's how and when should we start working with a verifier?
Well, my view, and of course you can imagine I might be a little biased, but I think why not from the beginning? So once you have an inventory, you decide to create an inventory, you can start to engage a verifier. Maybe the selection process takes a while. You find one. They can start with something called like a pre-engagement, or where they're not consulting, but they're not going through the full detail, right? A normal full verification with a verification statement at the end. But they're looking at your processes. Are they rigorous? Are they are you finding the right emission factors? Are you doing the right calculations, using the right methodologies? Are you following the rules required? So they can start to give you that feedback, particularly, at the beginning. Like I said, you may not know it, you may not get it right, or even if you're getting it right, you're not that sure. The verifier can help you on that. So I say right from the beginning.
Awesome. And then one more popped up here. It says, which sector benefits most from the GHG verification?
Yeah, I think any sector can benefit, but I would say especially the ones that have a big public, if you will, where the public is paying attention to them, and they have to be credible, and they have to be looked at as being credible. And how do they do that? Well, one way they say, well, here's our greenhouse gas inventory, and here is my certificate from the greenhouse gas verifier that says it's true, right? And it says it's right and accurate. So particularly those ones with a big reputation, the brand names, the household brand names. I gave that one slide, you saw all those all of those companies for sure, right? Any of those sectors.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's all the questions that we have. I want to thank you so much, Nelson, for doing this for us today and taking on John's slides because he's sick. Okay,
No
everybody,
problem.
this is going to conclude our webinar for today, and we'll be sending out the recordings and slides, and we also will be putting that course that we will be having on December 5th for calculating your carbon footprint. If you want to sign up for that, that will be listed as well in our follow-up email. So please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you very much, Allison. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. Wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.